So King Saul had fallen out of favor, and the prophet Samuel was tasked with finding a new king. So we've been following this story all summer. God sent Samuel to the family of Jesse, where he stood in front of each one of his sons, but none was the right one. You know the story well, that David was pulled away from his daydreaming and chasing butterflies and stood in front of Samuel and was proclaimed God's choice. And we know how extraordinarily brave David was, how he stood up to the giant that no one else dared approach, and how he led soldiers into one battle after another and kept winning against immense odds. He was far from perfect. And perhaps the most egregious example of that was the story of abuse we heard last week. The story began, in the spring of the year when kings go off to war. King David stayed behind and was soon bored. He rambled around his palace and then went up on the roof to survey the beautiful new city he had established in his name. Behold, the city of David, Jerusalem. And from his perch high above everyone else, his eye caught a beautiful woman bathing on her roof. And he learned that her name was Bathsheba and that she was married to one of his soldiers. But he wanted her for himself and sent for her. He used his advantage of his position as king, and she got pregnant. Now, her husband was away at war, so David's solution to cover up his actions was to bring her husband home for some R&R, which during this time of rest, their relaxation, would result in a child, and no one would be the wiser. But when Uriah came home, he didn't think it was fair that he would be able to enjoy the company of his wife while the fellow soldiers were still fighting. He wouldn't do it, so David sent him back into battle with a note for his commander to put him at the front line. It happened as David wanted. And when Uriah died in battle, David felt relieved. No one would find out what he had done. So he took Bathsheba as his wife, and she bore his son, one that he could pass off as a legitimate as long as no one counted how many months she had been pregnant. But God knew all this was happening. And God was, let's say, unhappy. And I'll say more later. But enter the messenger of God to deliver that news. So Nathan was a prophet in the court of King David, surrounded by yes-men, sycophants, who said things full of fawning and flattery to stay in the king's good graces. They would say anything the king would like to hear so they could continue to enjoy the privileges of their proximity to power. Nathan wasn't one of those guys. Somehow he had the courage to tell David the truth, and David somehow trusted that he told the truth. And so one day Nathan came to David with a case to settle for him to settle. And it was relatively straightforward. We heard a rich man had taken the lamb of a poor man because he was too stingy to take one of his own to feed a visitor. The rich man had plenty of flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. He wouldn't miss a single one. And the poor man, however, had only one single lamb whom he loved so dearly she ate from his table and, in my translation, slept in his arms. So Nathan asked, what should we do? David was enraged. In my translation, he called the rich man demonic and proclaimed not only death, but that the man must restore the lamb. Again, my translation says not 4 times, 7 times over. Because, quote, he had no compassion. Well, that's an interesting use of words, right? Not because it was an obvious display of outrageous greed and privilege. He had no compassion. Then Nathan took a deep breath. He adjusted his robe, he tightened his belt, and he dared say, what would have gotten almost anyone else killed. You're that man. But he wasn't finished. Nathan reminded him, you've been given everything you've ever wanted. And he spoke these words from God. I anointed you king and delivered you from Saul's deranged jealousy. I gave you a home and many wives to embrace. I gave you the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that was too little for you, I would have given you even more. You could have just asked. So why have you despised me and done evil in my sight? Or in other words, what is wrong with you? David listened to this blistering attack, and then Nathan proclaimed God's judgment. A shocking, extreme takedown, trigger warning given. Right in front of your eyes, I'm going to take your wives away and give them to your friend. But God isn't done. Your friend will have sex with your wives, but wait for it. Your friend will have sex with your wives in the middle of the street, in broad daylight, because what you did in secret, I'm going to do in the light of day in front of all Israel. And I swear to God, I swear to myself, you're going to pay for this. Talk about making it personal. God was, and I can't really say it in polite company, but God was PO'd. And imagine David's shock, standing there shaking his mouth wide open. And what could he say in his defense? He had been exposed. He gave no excuses. He didn't deflect. He didn't compare himself to someone else and say, but what about? He simply agreed, you're right. What is wrong with me? I've sinned against God. And without skipping a beat, without sending David away for a timeout to think about what he had done, Nathan said, the Lord has removed your sin. Wait, that's it? However, he added, that child will die. And Nathan went home. What a story. A rich man stole the lamb of a poor man because he was too stingy to take one of his own to feed a visitor. A man so rich, he had flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. He wouldn't miss a single one. On the other hand, the poor man had only one single lamb whom he loved so dearly, she ate from his table and slept in his arms. Such a sweet and tender description. And Nathan told David, that was you. That's what you did to Uriah. That's what you did to Bathsheba. That's what you did to God. Nathan went home, and David just stood there. Now, Psalm 51 is entitled, A Psalm of David when the prophet Nathan came to him after he had been with Bathsheba. David cried out, have mercy on me, O God, according to your faithful love. Wipe away my wrongdoings according to your great compassion. Wash me completely clean of my guilt. Purify me, because I know my wrongdoings. I've sinned against you. I've committed evil in your sight, and that's why you are justified when you render your verdict. Completely correct when you issue your judgment, because you want truth even in the most hidden places. In other words, our mothers may even have told us this, do what's right even if no one else knows. But when we don't, since none of us is perfect, we can say, as David pleads, create in me a clean heart, O God. Put a new and faithful spirit deep inside. Please, don't throw me out of your presence. Please, Don't take your Holy Spirit away from me. Return the joy of your salvation to me and sustain within me a willing spirit. It's a beautiful, sincere, heartfelt psalm that makes a lot more sense when you put it in the context. This is David's response to what he did. And yet, forgiveness did not erase the consequences of what he did. Got that? Forgiveness didn't erase the consequences. Back to the text, it continues. The child that Uriah's wife had borne for David. Now notice, it didn't say Bathsheba's child as though she had consented to it. No, David's child, born of Uriah's wife, became very sick. David beseeched for the boy and refused to eat. He spent every night sleeping on the ground. And on the seventh day, David saw his servants talking among themselves and asked, "Is the child dead?" And they replied, "Yes." And David stood up, bathed, anointed himself, changed his clothes. The servants didn't understand. Why would he do these things now that the child was dead? Why eat now? And David said, "I can't bring him back. One day I'll go to where he is, but he won't come to me." And then he went to comfort Bathsheba, for whom she was not responsible for all these things that had happened. But soon after, she gave birth to a son and named him Solomon. God loved him. And also, despite everything, despite everything, God never stopped loving David. This is a real story, by which I don't mean it's historically accurate. I mean it's a real story because it's raw. It's realistic. And because this story is honest, it's hopeful. I went to the prison again this week to meet with gay and transgender inmates who are eager and even excited to talk about their faith. And this time, a few straight and very macho-looking fathers came too because they said they want to better understand their gay children. These macho men, tears in their eyes, said, "I want to be here to help support them when the rest of their families won't." See, the nearly universal story of these beautiful souls is rejection. Rejection from their families, rejection by their churches for their gender identity or sexual orientation. And we may think, oh, the world has changed so much. Not for some people. This is a way too familiar story still these days. And yet still, their sincere hope is that God hasn't rejected them. And some, in fact, have a fierce faith that God has not and will not reject them. And I marvel at and am moved by the embodiment, their embodiment of the truth that they are more than the worst thing they've ever done, for which they are taking responsibility. But with this group, forget about platitudes. So we talked about making chosen families wherever we are, and they connected with Jesus hanging on the cross, telling John to take care of his mother. While he was being executed and had been abandoned by his closest friends, Jesus took care of his family. He made sure they would be okay. Realistic, they thought. And it was hopeful. It was honest. And David was honest. It was my fault. And he was forgiven. His sin removed. But he wasn't spared the consequences of his actions. And we may ask then, so what good is forgiveness? Forgiveness isn't a fairy tale. Forgiveness isn't trivial. It comes after sometimes horrible pain. And sometimes it's easier to forgive others. Amen? At Bible study on Thursday, several joked sincerely that we have higher standards for forgiving ourselves than God does. And yet I find it helpful to remember that forgiveness does not erase what we've done, nor all the memories or the pain, and yet we are free. We are not forever defined by what we did, but by who we became. We are not forever defined by what we did, but by who we became, or rather, who we are becoming. The poetry that grew out of David's pain is some of the most beautiful of any century. And we know that God was angry, but it was for a moment, as it says in Psalm 30. God's favor was for a lifetime. I cried out for help, and you healed me. You pulled me up. You changed my grief into dancing. You took off my funeral clothes and dressed me up in joy. And yes, there is weeping at night, but joy does come in the morning. You see, that's what forgiveness is good for. And this morning, might there be something for which you are ready to be honest?